Hello again. This week I would like to talk with you about the early modern period in Western philosophy that was marked by a move towards what's now referred to as rationalism. The rationalists had a great deal to say about the self and our knowledge of the self, and so I wanted to introduce that line of thought and in the process tell you about the very famous, very influential philosopher mathematician René Descartes. His dates were 1596 to 1650. He was a philosopher, French philosopher, scientist, and mathematician. He was the inventor of analytic geometry, of what we now call the Cartesian coordinate system, and he had interest in optics and meteorology as well. He's commonly credited with initiating the modern era of philosophy, and he was wary of the fate of Galileo down in Italy, and we believe that he probably suppressed publications of some of his writings in order to avoid being persecuted by religious authorities of his day. This book, The Meditations, which I hope will be available to you for reading, it's fairly brief but pretty dense, is kind of like a manifesto for the new method of conducting inquiry that Descartes wanted to espouse, propound, get other people to buy into, and follow him into greater and higher forms of knowledge in the process. The aims of the meditation were multifold. One of them was to use reason to establish theism. Theism is the doctrine that God exists, that being that has all possible perfections, such as omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, exists as a genuine thing. That is, he wanted to use reason to establish that God, as described, does indeed exist. He wanted to prove that the mind is a distinct kind of substance from the body. We'll be talking a lot about that in the coming lectures. And part of his method will be to demand that the mind should be free from prejudices and withdrawn from association with the senses. That is to say, for Descartes, contrary to what common sense, common opinion might lead you to think, the senses are very misleading in the way they give us information about the world. We need to use the senses, but we need to be careful about what we draw from them so that we aren't misled about how things are in reality. And in the process, Descartes is going to be championing an alternative to the doctrine of empiricism, namely rationalism. Empiricism is the doctrine that essentially all knowledge comes from and only from the senses. So an implication of this is going to be that if you claim that you know something, then someone else should always be in a position to ask you, to challenge you by saying, okay, what's the experimental, sensory, observational evidence that you can cite in support of that idea? You claim that, it's easy enough, you claim that it's raining outside, well, we should be able to verify that with our senses. You claim that there's a black hole in the center of the galaxy, we should be able to verify that with our senses as well. And here's a more challenging one. You claim that, for example, torturing people for the sake of your own personal entertainment is wrong. Can we verify that with our senses? Or you claim that 2 plus 2 is 4. How would you verify that with our senses? Just because every time we've taken 2 things and added 2 more things to them and gotten 4 doesn't seem to prove that it always and necessarily must be that way. So the doctrine of empiricism actually has some substantial implications. It implies that even our knowledge that 2 plus 2 is 4, or that torture for the sake of the fun of it is wrong, that even if we do claim to know those things, that we'd have to be able to trace our support, our basis for those claims in some experiential realm, and that's not easy to do. So rationalism comes on the scene and says, right, in fact, it's not just not easy to do, it's impossible. We should give up on empiricism, says the rationalist. And the rationalist doctrine goes something like this, that the proper use of our reasoning, those reasoning faculties, can give us the information that we need, all the information that we need about nature, about what is right or wrong, about mathematics, and perhaps in some way even about the external world, the world external to our bodies and minds. This doctrine of rationalism was associated with Descartes and then later philosophers such as Spinoza and Leibniz. Rationalists emphasized the use of reason. Few of them would deny that we get any information from sensation, but would say something more like this, that sensation is to knowledge as, for example, food is to knowledge. You need food in order to know anything, in order to metabolize, just as you need sensation in order to think, but it's only a source, only a kind of thing that produces knowledge but isn't a justification for it. So Descartes starts out, and I'll be marching fairly close to the page and pages as we go through Descartes' meditations in order for us to understand where he's coming from, because the writing is dense, it's subtle, it's very powerful, but it repays careful attention. So, starting out, Meditation 1. And I should emphasize, by the way, that this book of Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy, has a carefully chosen title. He is engaged in a meditative process. That is to say, after having received a good education early on in his life, he became kind of a soldier of fortune. He was concerned with philosophical questions, but he felt for a long time that he didn't really have the energy or courage or intellectual power to try to answer them in the way that he thought was satisfactory. So he went off. He was kind of a mercenary. He apparently engaged in lots of gambling and dueling, touring around the world. Finally, he came back and sat down in a little hovel or a little shack somewhere in the forest and began to think about whether he could really make progress on these philosophical questions. He detached himself from associations with others. He tried to get focus away from the evidence of the senses and just wanted to cogitate as best he could. And as he sat down to meditate on the nature and extent and source of his knowledge, he found himself thinking that many of the things that he thought that were obviously true when he was young are things that he now takes to be highly dubitable. So, for example, suppose you thought early on in your life, suppose you were raised at about the time that Descartes was or before, and so early in your life you followed what we now call the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, according to which the Earth is the center of the universe. And everything else, stars, sun, planets, revolve around it. If you didn't have Copernicus around, or the powerful experimental and observational techniques that we have now, that would be a fairly common sense thing to think. That would seem pretty obvious, that the Earth that we're on stays still, with the occasional exception of an earthquake here or a a volcanic eruption there. Things are pretty sturdy here on Earth, and it looks, from an intuitive, common sense kind of point of view, that everything else moves around us, we're stationary, we're the center of things. But then suppose that you found out later on in your life that actually there's this guy, Copernicus, up in Poland, who's been saying that that's not so, that he's got a better theory that explains phenomena more effectively, according to which, at least with the known universe thus far, the sun is the center and the Earth and other planets revolve around it. And suppose that you followed Copernicus' line of reasoning closely enough to become convinced that indeed that is how things are, that the sun is the center of the known universe and the Earth revolves around the sun. So now you're reflecting on that and you say to yourself, well, there was something that I believed, namely the Ptolemaic view, according to which the Earth is the center of the universe, that seemed obviously true, unquestionably obviously true back when I was 10 or 12 or 15. But now that I'm 25 or 30, say, I now believe that that's untrue, that I was wrong, that was a mistake, and that careful scrutiny of the evidence shows that in fact the sun is the center of things, the Earth is not. That, I think, could give you, and certainly gave Descartes, a kind of case of the willies, that is to say, a kind of funny feeling that you might make you wonder, what other of my beliefs that I think are obvious could turn out to be wrong too? Maybe I'm being kind of dogmatic in supposing these other things to be true. Now that I've learned my lesson from how something that seems so self-evident and obvious and unquestionable turns out to have been dubious and in fact wrong, maybe there are other things that I take now to be self-evident, obvious, unquestionable, that I should look upon with some skepticism and begin to reconsider. So that is essentially what Descartes says on page 1 of the first meditation, when he says, "Several years now have passed since I first realized how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those that I had subsequently built upon them." So he talks about the false opinions of his youth and realizes that not only that view about the relation of the Earth to the rest of the universe, but also other things that he built upon that belief were things that he had to give up. And thus I realized that once in my life I had to raise, that is, sort of pull everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. Because who knows, maybe tomorrow morning I'll wake up, someone will send me a letter showing that yet another thing I took to be obvious is in fact questionable after all. But the task seemed enormous, he says, and I was waiting until I reached a point in my life that was so timely that no more suitable time for undertaking these plans of action would come to pass. For this reason I procrastinated for so long That's when he was a soldier of fortune, mercenary, gambler, dueler, and so forth. I procrastinated for so long, I would henceforth be at fault were I to waste the time that remains for carrying out the project by brooding over it. Accordingly, I have today suitably freed my mind of all cares, secured for myself a period of leisurely tranquility, and am withdrawing into solitude. And at last I will apply myself earnestly and unreservedly to this general demolition of my opinions. When he talks about a general demolition of his opinions, what he means is he's going to do his best to sit back and take a hard, skeptical look at as many of the things that he believes as he possibly can. He realizes it's going to be difficult, but he's going to try as hard as he can to step outside his belief system, as it were, and begin to ask, which of the things in this belief system can I really accept as definitely true, as opposed to the things that I could justifiably, even conceivably doubt. So a lot happens in that first paragraph, because he makes a reference to the false opinions of his youth. But he realizes that it's not as if he can just blithely say, okay, I was wrong, whatever, now I know everything that I think I know, it's all fine now, because he realizes that it could happen again. It could be there's something else in his belief system that he also takes to be obviously correct, that he might find 10 or 20 years from now to look back on and say, no, that was a terrible mistake as well. And if we think about the growth of knowledge in society, humanity broadly, not just in that of an individual person, there are many, many cases in which we now look back and say, boy, those people back in the Middle Ages or ancient Greece or ancient China or something had some crazy views about how the body worked, or about space, or about time, or what makes things alive, how matter operates, things of that sort. So that could justify one in saying, okay, let's take a look at my belief system now. I'd like, if at all possible, to figure out which things are worth holding on to and which things need to be chucked. So that's what Descartes' really about. That's the first paragraph. A whole lot happens in that first paragraph, and I urge you to read over that carefully, take notes as best you can, raise any questions that you might want to, and we'll get back to the next paragraph in just a moment.